Hello, Misfits, and welcome to my review of Limerick Cadence Mansion. Before we begin, I want to thank the wonderful people over at Plan of Attack for providing me this code. It came as quite a surprise. We got to play the preview, and now we are doing a review after I've made it all the way through the game. On stream, no less. Imagine that. The way this is going to work is I'm going to give you a overview review and then something that might be a little spoilery, so I will let you know when the spoilers begin. If you are interested in playing, you can check it out on Steam. I will leave the link down in the description. All right, to start, we're going to be talking about the gameplay and controls. It's one of the easier things to talk about without getting into spoiler territory. And to be honest, the controls didn't really thrill me. They were a bit clunky to get used to, although I did end up getting used to them. The keybinds, you couldn't find a list in the menu. In order to change your keybinds, should you want to, it actually took you key by key by key. So one of those things was, you know, even if you only wanted to change one, you had to go through and rebind each and every key that there was a binding for. I wasn't a huge fan of that because if I wanted to rebind my crouch button, I had to go through rebinding my forward, backwards, strafing, jumping, everything. Although there wasn't really jumping. I digress. So the controls, like, I wish they would have told us a little better what controls did what leading into it, because the first thing I literally did when I picked up the pistol was accidentally took a shot. At the time I only had 6, well, then 5 bullets, and it basically immediately wasted one. At the time, I didn't know how plentiful or scarce ammo was going to be, so that kind of terrified me. I guess that's a little bit of horror in the controls. Gameplay-wise, pretty darn solid. You know, everything you did what you expected it to. Forward went forward. Sprinting was actually rather satisfying, even at its lower levels, because it was quick, and it actually lasted a decent amount of time. When it came to dealing with enemies, for the most part, you were able to sneak around if you needed to. There were some places they forced you into combat, of course, because, you know, hence the way the games are generally played. However, there were enemies you could sneak around if you so chose to do so. Getting away from those enemies, one of the ways you could get away is if they were giving chase and they were relentless. There are these panic closets that you could duck into if you had the battery charged up and everything. And the panic closets are interesting. Panic closets, they regen your health, they regen your energy, and they regen one of your main weapons. The unfortunate part is, at least at the time I played, right now we're at mid-October, the panic closets didn't always work. They would occasionally glitch out so that the enemies would stay right outside, sometimes even phasing partially through the door, and you wouldn't get healed or regen your energy or anything like that. That was a little bit of a downturn for me. I'm not sure if that's something that's going to be patched in the future. I do understand that the game was made by one person, so I understand if changes are slow, fixes are slow, it is okay. Just something I wanted to bring attention to. There was a quick fix for it, though. If you push the button to reopen and then real quick pushed it to reclose, generally that solved the glitch issue. Moving on to the theme and atmosphere. The theme and atmosphere, beautiful. Loved it, 10 out of 10. Just realized I didn't tell you, 7 out of 10 for controls and gameplay. But theme and atmosphere, 10 out of 10. Having everything pretty much poetry or writing or song related, including the names of the enemy types and, of course, well, our main villain, Limerick, it's just beautiful. Completely and utterly love that. You had elegies. One of the big events is called a ballad. It was great for me. As for the atmosphere, everything was often tense. Some of the enemies you could hear that you were coming upon them, others you could not, so you turn a corner and oh my god, there they are. The the mixture of tech in the game. So there were things from old-timey times. I don't want to get too much into it right now. There were things from old-timey times, kind of antique style, but also more updated technology. And I thought that was a real good mix. It kind of brought you into what is this world and why is it the way it is. As for scares, most of them for me were more jump scares. I don't get scared very easily. My community on Twitch can attest to that. And the biggest scares often came in the maze portions of the game. One of my biggest ones was Limerick, just kind of appearing out of nowhere from the dark, and I got so jump scared I actually paused the game when at the time I didn't know how to pause the game. So that was adventurous. So the scares were, for me, more jump scares. However, your mileage may vary because the atmosphere was just so tense. I could see how turning around the corner and going, oh shit, would be a thing. Next, we're going to hop over into spoiler-free story. Just so you know, story for me was a 9 out of 10. The lore was very engaging. Most of the time you found out the lore through little pieces of paper that people had written. I'm not going to go into what they were writing about or what was going on, but the lore was fascinating. Learning about these characters was amazing that way because you more so saw how they thought rather than, oh, this is a person and they do the thing. So that was very engaging for me. And being able to see how they were reacting to the events happening was beautiful. I will say I was not a huge fan of the game not pausing while you were trying to read those things. So if there was an enemy that spotted you while you were reading it and you didn't hear him coming, you would definitely take damage. You could pause the game while reading these once I figured out how to pause the game. But it would have the big, game paused letters over it, so you couldn't really read the notes. That being said, a lot of the times you could take care of all the enemies and go back and read it. However, especially in the beginning, that was not something I was aware of. And so I think I was rushing through and reading a lot of things really quick. We're going to real quick hop over to enemies. I don't have too terribly much to go into spoiler free on the enemies. Most of the common enemies were rather varied. They each had their very distinct characteristics in how they moved, what their attacks were like, how beefy they were, how difficult to kill. And that's pretty much all I've got to say about it. I do have one criticism. One of the enemies does this little twitchy thing, and basically it only stays in that position before it twitches again for about 1.5 seconds, which is barely enough time to line up a shot, which I'm not the best first-person shooter player. So that was a little challenging for me. So that's kind of why I docked the enemies, along with an aspect of the bosses that I wasn't too fond of. One boss in particular was a very large bullet sponge, but I will get to that in the spoiler section. Next up, we're going to deal with pacing. Up front, pacing I gave a 7 out of 10. The game is basically broken up into 3 sections. This game has a love of threes, which you will find, but I will detail that more so in the spoiler section. But the 3 main sections were your main sections that kind of move you along with the lore, move you around to the next major area. And then you have the mazes, which are big old puzzle mazes. And then you've got your boss fights. Self-explanatory. The main areas, the main sections that move you in between everything, I felt were really well done, really well layered. It wasn't easy to get lost because that's an issue for me. I am a little bit navigationally challenged, so I was very thankful that the main areas were relatively easy to navigate. And that was beautiful. For the boss fights, 2 of the 3 I really enjoyed. And then as for the mazes were the main reason that I docked pacing down to a 7. because of the nature of the mazes, it really slowed down the pace. I understand that this game was not meant to be a go, go, go all the time. However, the pacing was slowed down quite a bit during the maze sections. One thing before we move on to the spoiler section, I realized I neglected to say something about the weapons. You start the game with one weapon, and early on you gain a pistol, and then later on you have multiple times and places that you can acquire a machine gun. The weapons themselves worked as intended. They did damage to certain enemies, not as much damage to others, and you were able to upgrade them. If I have one bit of wisdom for you, spoiler free, do your best to upgrade your weapons, especially the energy weapon. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. To do this, there are scraps and resources around that you can find and collect. These resources also unlock the save stations. The save stations are where you can view your collectibles, you can save, you can heal fully, and that's the only way you will save in this game. There are no checkpoints, there is no autosave. It's like old school PS1 game all over again. So since save stations and upgrades use the same type of materials to upgrade and power up, the best thing I have to suggest for you is to think about how valuable that save may or may not be for you. I know I unlocked every save station except for one, and I feel as though my weapons weren't upgraded quite well enough for the final boss. When originally recording this review, I forgot to mention the Sandbox Mode. The Sandbox Mode allows you to play through any of the 3 mazes in pretty much any configuration you would like. You get to choose your strength, which weapons are available, the strength of the weapons, if you have any of your special powers, what Limerick's mode is, spawning of enemies, how the panic closets react, you know, pretty much anything. And I thought that was really neat. However, if you are trying to go into this experience blind, you may not want to enter the Sandbox Mode first. Play through the full game, and then you can go back and enjoy the mazes in any way you so choose. Alrighty, so for those of you who are here and don't mind spoilers, welcome on in. For those of you who are trying to avoid them, just know I give the game a solid 8.5 out of 10, but I'm going to go into a little bit of spoiler territory, nothing that tells you too much about the outcome of the game. I was talking about the lore and how it all pertained to poetry or songs or writing, and that's because you are called the proofreader. Obviously, your main bad guy is Limerick, which in and of itself is a type of poetry, and the big event that is happening is called a ballad. Now, these ballads, from my understanding, happen every so often. They're spurred on by Limerick, and usually the company that has control of Limerick keeps them under control. However, this ballad has been the biggest one, and it ultimately ends up pretty much destroying everything is what it comes down to. And that's kind of where you get brought in. This takes place on its own self-contained island where there's obviously a big old mansion. Limerick was found back in, I believe, the 1800s, and has been found to have special powers, which this company has been harvesting. Now, these people that get drafted in basically aren't allowed contact with the outside world. Everyone from their past life thinks that they are dead, and they are paid an exorbitant amount of money. However, they rarely keep it themselves because they're not going to be able to get off the island to spend it. So it generally gets sent to loved ones or to pay off debts or so on and so on. And I found that as a really interesting premise for employment. It made me think, is this a deal I would take? And in today's day and age, maybe. You never know. All right, so going through the main areas, you often meet a lot of common enemies, and you learn how to fight them off or sneak around them as time goes on. The panic closets, when well utilized, actually make this very easy. However, I didn't learn to utilize them well until the third main section. It's an issue with me. Do not worry. I know that it's not an issue with the game. I just am a little slow on the uptake occasionally. Also, going through the main areas, each main area has a small mini puzzle room where you have to solve 3 puzzles before you can get into the next area, which in general leads to the maze or the next maze. And those little puzzle rooms are a lot of fun. I found those puzzles, for the most part, rather easy. However, they were fun. And that was really rewarding, just being able to... I didn't fly through them. There was some trial and error with some, but they were a lot of fun. Now, my problem with the mazes, and this may just be a me problem, but the mazes, each maze has 3 main types of puzzles in it. And each type of puzzle, you have to complete 3 times. All the while, there are almost continuously spawning enemies. They aren't spawning quickly, but they are spawning quickly enough that you are concerned for your resources and, of course, your health. There are panic closets throughout, so utilizing those is key, and that's ultimately what got me through most of them. However, again, as I said, I didn't learn to utilize the panic closets until the 3rd main section. So for the mazes, I've stated that there are 3 different types of puzzles per maze, and you have to complete them 3 times each. So before you complete the first puzzle the first time in any of the mazes, you pretty much have free reign to roam around and gather any resources or clues that you need for the puzzles. You do have the common enemies roaming around, and they will attack you, and they will keep spawning, but at least as long as you keep your ear out, they're not too big of a deal. Herein lies one of my biggest issues with the mazes, and one of the reasons it slows down the pacing so much, is the common enemies in the mazes at almost every single point know exactly where you are. So no matter if you've broken line of sight and ran halfway across the maze and ducked down to hide behind something, they know exactly where you are. So trying to get away from them, the only way to do so is spending about 15 to 20 seconds in a panic closet. As for Limerick will show up after you finish the first puzzle the first time. And that's when he enters the maze. And then after you complete 3 puzzles, he will level up, basically. He will get more dangerous, he'll get faster, and also the lights in the maze will dim more. And then after you complete another 3, same thing. One of the things I neglected to mention earlier was that there are puzzle bypass levers that you are able to use in a pinch, at least if you are playing on the easiest or the middle difficulty. I was playing on the middle difficulty because that is the default. That is what was recommended. So that's what I played. And I believe I only used a puzzle bypass lever twice. Once in the final maze, and once for a puzzle that, had I continued down the path of the main areas, I would have found the solution to. So for the most part, most of the puzzles are easy to figure out. The maze one I used, it was just because I was having a lot of trouble maneuvering around the maze, remembering where things were, and being able to complete it. So it was just taking far too much time, so I figured I'm going to use this. Limerick in the mazes goes by line of sight, so as long as you stay out of his line of sight, for the most part, you'll be fine. And every time he sees you, he doesn't necessarily chase after you, which is, in my opinion, a very big saving grace for the game. But those were the main issues I had with the mazes. Now, the boss fights. The first and second bosses, I loved. They were inventive character designs. They were not too difficult to figure out, but, you know, there was still some mental mind work that had to go into it. You had to figure out what you had to do in order to actually damage them, which was nice. The third boss was the most difficult for me, mainly because he was a bullet sponge. And it was one of those things where he has a lot of movements that you have to memorize how to dodge or avoid or counter. And I was not doing well with that. And then I got lucky. He ended up glitching and could not move. I tried to get him to move. I did my best to try to get him to move around and so I could fight him fair and square. But unfortunately, he was stuck there. I decided that since I had already tried to fight him 3 or 4 times, that I wasn't going to reload and that I was just going to complete the fight in the glitched state. Unfortunately, it still took me 10 to 15 minutes to beat him, even not having to do any of the evasion or the counters. I literally sat there and just kept shooting and shooting and shooting and shooting at him. And that was kind of an issue for me. I did not like how bullet spongy he was, and the fact that if it took me 10 to 15 minutes, I'll put the timestamp right there for how long it took me. So if it took me that long to beat him without having to do any of the evasion or the counters, I can only imagine how long it would have taken me to beat him if I had to. And with only 6 bubbles of health, 6 hits I could take, I was okay. I was okay beating him in the way that I did. So that's my review of Limerick Cadence Mansion. I definitely recommend, especially if you are a fan of tense atmospheres, dark atmospheres, and blending of old and new. I also recommend if you are terrified of mannequins but enjoy horror games, because Limerick will definitely give you the shivers. So with that, folks, thank you so much for watching the video. Hit that like button, subscribe, do the usual YouTube things. Thanks for being here. I love you. I'll catch you on the flip side.